In addition to being an astonishingly popular piece of advice, follow your passion is also an astonishingly bad piece of advice. Be so good they can't ignore you. If you do that, lots of other good things will come. This is why I think our productivity metrics have been stagnant for over a decade, is even though the tech has gotten more advanced, we have fragmented our attention to the degree that we're actually really bad at the core thing that we need to do.
Digital minimalism is a philosophy of technology use.
Top 10, I got a top 10. Got my motivation high for my top 10. Gotta learn from the wise women and men. All my life, like na 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 na. For my top 10, top 10, top 10, na 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 na. This one's for my top 10.
Okay, let's kick it off with rule number 1, study success.
You should look to, let's say, professional musicians, professional athletes, professional chess players, people who have to get good in a world that has a well-defined competence hierarchy, where you have a chess ranking and you can't run away from it. You have a batting average, right? You know, like you can't get away from it. Watch how they train. Because in their world, there's a lot of effort that has gone into how do you systematically improve. And what you see is that they deliberately practice. And there's really no shortcut to deliberate practice to gaining mastery in almost any field, but in knowledge work in particular, so in this sort of whole array of sort of various creative and other types of professions, we don't think that way, and people don't actually do a lot of this sort of systematic practice, and so that's why in So Good They Can't Ignore You, I go and I hang out with a professional guitar player. And I say, okay, I want to watch you practice. And in this case, there's actually a good reason to do so, because this is someone who started playing guitar at the same time that I started playing guitar. And at the age where like I was not that great. I played in a rock band and we were like, okay. He had a record deal and was being heralded as like this talent, right, in new acoustic guitar playing. So I said, great, I want to understand why did he become really, really good? And I didn't. Watching him practice in this sort of musician's frat house he lived in Boston with all these other musicians, answer the question 100%. He was so intense when he was practicing the guitar that he would forget to breathe, right? So he'd be doing this, he was trying to get a lick faster. So the way he got the lick faster is let me play it about 10% faster than I can comfortably play it. And he was so concentrated that he'd forget to breathe. And so he would do these ragged gasps every once in a while when his body would force him to take in air. That's the whole difference. I never did that. That's stretching. You're like, what I need to do is be better at this lick. And so I'm gonna push myself beyond where I'm comfortable.
Also, if you want to have more confidence, check out my 254 series. It's free. The link to join is in the description below.
I was reminded this morning of a question I'm often asked. How do you eliminate fear from your life?
If you're doing work that you love, you're more likely to follow through. You're more likely to do it because it doesn't feel like work, because you love doing it.
In a success world, please understand that success is happiness, not net dollars in.
Rule number 2, get rid of social media.
Digital minimalism is a philosophy of technology use. And it says what you should do is wipe the slate clean of the various apps and services that you haphazardly downloaded or just started using at various parts in your digital life, and instead rebuild it from scratch, but very intentionally, so that the tools that you actually use in your digital life directly serve things that you very care about. When it comes to social media, I think you have to understand what's actually happening with this product, which is this is an experience that has evolved over time from what it used to be, which was a relatively static way for you to post information about yourself and see information from people you care about. It shifted from that into an experience in which they are sending a stream of social approval indicator about yourself at you all day long. Likes and retweets and tags of photos that are constantly coming at you, delivered through this app. And then every time you hit this button, you might see some new indication that someone else was thinking about you. That type of behavior, that experience, is something that was not innovated because it made users happier. This is an experience that has been engineered to make you a compulsive user of your phone, and therefore should be something that makes you wary.
Rule number 3, don't just follow your passion.
American culture is obsessed with this idea that the only way to end up happy in what you do for a living is to follow your passion. You'd be hard-pressed to find a career guide book, a career counselor, or a career advice blogger whose whole philosophy somewhere deep down is not based on this idea. But there's also a problem here. So the more I researched into this issue, the more I became convinced that in addition to being an astonishingly popular piece of advice, follow your passion is also an astonishingly bad piece of advice. I want to be clear about what I mean by that. In science, in science, it's very hard to get things named after you, so I really overcompensate when it comes to my writing. There's nothing that's not too much. But what I'm saying here is that I have nothing against the goal of ending up passionate about what you do. In fact, that's what this whole talk is about. How do people actually get there? What I'm arguing, however, is that the specific strategy of identifying a pre-existing passion and then following it is a bad strategy for achieving that goal. There's a couple reasons I believe this. First, follow your passion presupposes that you have a pre-existing passion that you can identify and follow. We actually don't have a lot of evidence that this is true for most people. In fact, one study I wrote about had a psychologist take a large group of seniors, this is at a Canadian university, a large group of seniors, and they subjected them to all of these questionnaires to try to figure out what, if anything, they were passionate about. And I went back and went through the data, and even being very generous in my accounting, it was less than 5% of these students that actually had a passion that was even remotely relevant to a career choice. You probably guessed the number one passion is Canadian University was hockey, turns out. The second problem is that follow your passion presupposes that if you really like something and then match that to your job, you will then, from then on out, have a sort of long-term, engaging, and meaningful career. And this turns out to be an incredibly simplistic and reductive understanding of workplace satisfaction and what's involved in actually building a long-term career that provides both meaning and engagement. If you want this emphasized, look no farther than all the examples of passionate amateur photographers or passionate amateur bakers that end up miserable and overworked when they open their own photography studio or their own bakery. This tells us that something more is going on here. But I think actually the most ironic example of the insufficiency of this advice is actually Steve Jobs himself. So even though Steve Jobs stood on that stage in 2005 and said what people at least interpreted to mean, follow your passion, his biographers make it clear that that's not at all what he did. Right? His biographers tell us that in the period leading up to Apple Computer, Steve Jobs did not have an unusual passion for technology entrepreneurship. Apple was something that he stumbled into. One of his biographers put it this way: Apple was a small-time scheme that unexpectedly took off. But of course, no one doubts that Steve Jobs ended up quite passionate about what he did for a living. Which tells us the lesson here is it's not how you get started that matters. Maybe what matters is what you do once you get going.
Rule number 4, be so good they can't ignore you.
Be so good they can't ignore you. And so that's what Martin used to tell aspiring entertainers. And what he said was, well, they always were hoping there was going to be some secret, or here's how you get noticed, or here's how you get the right agent. And what he would always tell them is, be so good they can't ignore you. If you do that, lots of other good things will come. And so I ended up naming that book So Good They Can't Ignore You, is because that advice basically turns out to be incredibly applicable. Especially if you're new. Let's say you're new to the job market, you're right out of school. You want to be passionate about what you do. By far, probably the most important thing you can do, the most important step you can take if you want to maximize the probability that you have a fantastic working life, is put your head down and go into apprentice mode. I'm going to master something that's unambiguously valuable. You do that, on that foundation, all sorts of really good things come. Good things that include real satisfaction and passion for your work.
Rule number 5, live intentionally.
I think something that's going on here, and I think food's a good analogy, right? So in food, we're used to this idea that you might say something like, I don't eat this type of food. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's good for me, right? I mean, obviously this is a message you've talked and written a lot about, and no one comes back and says, well, Rich Roll is a sort of anti-food guy. He's not into eating or not nutrition, right? We're used to it in the idea of food that there's different qualities and you get different results out of it. And so I'm a tech guy. I mean, I'm a computer scientist. I'm an internet nerd. I was using the net before, there was World Wide Web browsers. I've been blogging for over a decade. And so I look at certain things like social media platforms, and to me, it's junk food. And so I don't see it as a stance of, neolitism to say, for example, I don't use Facebook. I see it more like saying I don't eat Doritos. And that you can love tech like I do, but not necessarily embrace all of the trends. And so that's a lot of the message I'm out there preaching, is that you have to be intentional, you have to be selective.
Rule number 6, have an insane work ethic.
So this is the environmental writer, the celebrated environmental writer, Bill McKibben. Now, Bill McKibben is someone who loves what he does for a living, okay? He is a celebrated author. He writes books full-time, maybe one every 2 or 3 years. They're big idea books. They're books on topics that he's interested in. He lives in this sort of idyllic town in Vermont, and he has a life, by all accounts, that he's very passionate about. So let's use him as our case study. Let's ask the question, how did Bill McKibben end up with a working life that he loved? Now, I would conjecture that the short answer to that question is skill. If we dive into the details of Bill McKibben's life, we see the turning point for him happened with the publication of his first book in the late 1980s. This was a book called The End of Nature, and it was quickly heralded as a new classic in the field of environmental books, the most important environmental book since Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. It immediately made him a celebrity author, at least within this field. It allowed him to quit his magazine job and quit the freelance assignments. He moved first to the Adirondacks and then to this small town in Vermont, and it allowed him to kick off this life of just writing about what interests to him, having an impact on the world, and really enjoying his life. But if we ask, well, how did he write The End of Nature? The important thing to keep in mind is by the time he actually got the book deal for that book, he had become one of the most talented environmental writers of his generation. He was a staff writer for The New Yorker who specialized in these issues. He had a big book deal from Random House to go write this book. The New Yorker serialized the book while he was writing it, so it was definitely going to be seen. It was definitely going to make an impact. The fact that he was such a talented writer by this point is what made him capable of transforming his life in this way that generated a lot of passion for him. Now, there's a question we have to ask here. How did he end up becoming one of the most talented environmental writers of his generation? And I want to conjecture here that he was not born a brilliant or naturally talented writer. And I'll use this as my exhibit A. This comes from, as far as I can tell in my research, the first published work of a young Bill McKibben. He published this in the Harvard Crimson soon after arriving as an undergraduate at Harvard University. It was a sports page article about the Celtics opening day game. So it doesn't take a Pulitzer committee to tell you that this is not good writing, okay? It's all the classic mistakes of a very young new writer. It's completely overblown, way too effusive, and of course a completely inappropriate tone for an article where people want to know whether Larry Bird was feeling healthy or not, which was the concern in 1979. But the point is, even if you talk to Crimson staffers today, and this is what it's important to know about Bill McKibben, they still talk about his lore at the Crimson, his work ethic. He wrote an absurd number of articles while there. There's this tale that they tell about, it was like a late Cambridge City Council meeting. They came back, he had an hour until deadline, and he bet the fellow editors, a bottle of scotch, that I'll get these 2 articles written and in before the deadline. And he won that bottle of scotch because that's the type of work ethic he had. He wrote an absurd number of articles and through sheer brute practice became a better and better writer. And by the time he graduated Harvard, he was the editor of the Crimson. That put him on the radar of Bill Shawn at the New Yorker, who hired him to edit those short talk of the town pieces in the front of the magazine. He worked at that really hard. They let him start tackling longer pieces. Eventually became a staff writer. He could specialize in the environment. Then The End of Nature happened. And he was able to transform his life into this one that he's very passionate about.
Rule number 7, do your research.
Well, I don't think we think enough about how hard it is to actually do interesting and successful things. And so this is a real issue that I got into in that original book, where young people in particular would write their own script for, this is how I want the world to work. This is how, I want to run this thing and I want it to be really successful and I want X, Y, and Z. And here's what I want to be important for this, that I'm on social media a lot is going to be key, and the fact that I'm just a young go-getter and this will all work out in about a year. But the reality is everything that is worthwhile is really, really hard, and it's often really, really specific. And so I'm always telling young people something very similar. before you make your plan for how you're going to execute, becoming a book author, for example, which a lot of people ask me about. So go talk to authors, figure it out. Figure out what the actual reality is of what matters and how people succeed. Don't write your own script with the answers that you want it to be, because often there's a real conflict. Because it's easy to come up with some plan where you're like, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. I'm going to write 20 pages a day, and something that's kind of hard but not too hard, and you think it's going to be fun, and it might have nothing to do with how that industry works. But on the other hand, if you can get the intelligence, maybe by interning with someone who can actually teach you about the field you really care about, and you understand, this is what's involved, then you know where to put your energy.
Rule number 8, explore.
Let's say you had a time machine and you could go back to meet a young Steve Jobs. Now, probably the first thing you would do is go buy Apple stock. But let's say you go back even earlier than that in a high school age Steve Jobs. The biographical sources we have today suggest that if you talk to a young Steve Jobs, you would not come away with the idea that he was passionate about building a technology company. He did not have, at that point in his life, a passion for changing the world through technology, right? So Steve Jobs did not go to Berkeley to study electrical engineering, which is what you would have done in that time, in that place, if you were really passionate about electronics. And he didn't go to Stanford or UCLA to study business, which is probably what you would have done in that time, in that place, if you're very passionate about entrepreneurship and business. He instead went to Reed College, a liberal arts school up in Oregon. He studied history, studied dance. Pretty soon afterwards, he dropped out and hung out on campus, walking around barefoot, experimenting with sort of extreme diets, bumming free meals from the Hare Krishna temple. Eventually, he got fed up with being completely destitute, came back to California, took a night shift job at Atari, and that was very specific because he wanted flexibility and not too much responsibility. And he began to study Eastern mysticism way more seriously. That had just arrived on the shores of the West Coast in this period. He went on a mendicant's journey to India in this point, months-long mendicant's journey to India, came back, started to study seriously at the Los Altos Zen Center, and began to spend an increasing amount of time at the All One Commune upstate. So the point of this is that this is a portrait of someone who is seeking. The classic example of someone young, early in their life, trying to figure out what life's about, what they want to do with their life. A lot of us go through this stage, but Jobs being Jobs couldn't just read Kerouac. He had to actually go to India and spend 3 months because he's intense about everything he does, but he's basically reflecting something that a lot of us went through ourselves, trying to understand what are we doing here, what's the meaning of life. He was in a seeking mode. But what's clear about that is this was certainly not someone with a crystal clear vision of, I am passionate about starting a technology company and I'm going to find a way to do that one way or the other.
Rule number 9, be truly productive.
So the problem with email and Slack, and this was really at the core of my last book, so not digital minimalism, but deep work.
Deep work.
Right, was this notion that as the knowledge economy in particular, so let's just look at knowledge work, and as you get past the entry level, knowledge work is really built on concentration. Because what you have to do, literally speaking, is take in information, think about it, produce new information that has value, right? I mean, that's the grist mill of knowledge work. So you introduce something like email, and it seems like a no-brainer. Like we write memos, it takes a long time. If we could do it electronically, it just has massive advantages. It's cheaper, it's faster, it's more stable. I can access it when I'm away from the mail. We don't need a whole mail room, right? It just seems like there's all these advantages to it, but there's unexpected consequences. And in particular, what happened is once we introduced things like email, it shifted the way we worked. And so subtly, our workflow shifted to something that I call the hyperactive hive mind, which is let's have a constantly ongoing unstructured conversation. And so this is how a lot of knowledge work now unfolds. Is you can use Slack or email or whatever tool. SMS is now integrated in the office a lot more, where we can anyone can reach anyone at any time. So it's like we have this ongoing unstructured conversation, which wasn't possible before, but this technology makes possible. It's not an unnatural thing to do. It's basically how we would coordinate if we were in like a small group of Paleolithic hunters. We would just sort of have an unstructured conversation. Right. You go that way, I'll go this way. We just scaled it up to large organizations by using these tools. The problem is if you have to tend this ongoing unstructured conversation, it forces you to have to keep changing your attention back to the communication tools and then back to the thing that you're actually trying to produce value on, then back to the communication tools. You have to context switch a lot. And the psychology literature tells us that context switching just completely reduces our cognitive capacity. It makes it very difficult for us to actually concentrate and produce value with our brain. So it was an inadvertent externality.
But by introducing these low friction communication tools, it changed the way we worked. It made things much more convenient. But by doing that, we actually got much worse at the core business of knowledge work, which requires concentration and producing value. And so this is why I think our productivity metrics have been stagnant for over a decade, is even though the tech has gotten more advanced, we have fragmented our attention to the degree that we're actually really bad at the core thing that we need to do, which is actually sitting there and writing the legal brief.
And rule number 10, the last one before a very special bonus clip, is use time blocking.
Let's say you buy this notion that the systematic development of rare and valuable skills is key to a working life you love. How do you actually do that? Say today, let's say in a creative or knowledge work type field. So I think the evidence suggests that this type of work plays a crucial role. We have decades of research from performance psychology as well as neuroscience that tells us that this state of cognitive strain, where you persist even though it's uncomfortable, is exactly the state in which you improve at a cognitive skill. So the heuristic is simple. If you want to be cultivating a rare and valuable skill in a knowledge work or creative pursuit, a non-trivial fraction of your work hours have to be dedicated to this type of work. Right? We know what this is. Right? Instead of being reactive about your day, you plan out in advance. This is what I'm going to do here, this is what I'm going to do there. This is a sample time block document from my notebook. As you can see, I block my hours on the left. On the right, I elaborate where needed. On the immediate right, I leave myself extra space so that I can repair the schedule as it gets disrupted during the day. It's simple. Now, of course, time blocking has lots of sort of general productivity benefits. It forces you to make critical decisions about your time. I think more importantly, it forces you to come to grips with how long things actually take, which turns out to play a crucial role in scheduling. But when it comes to deep work in particular, it's absolutely necessary. Deep work is not a natural activity. It's not something that you're going to do spontaneously. If you're not planning in advance what you do when, it's not going to show up in your schedule. So this is sort of the foundation on which deep work makes its way into knowledge work, working schedules.
Now I have a special bonus clip from Cal on how to lower the bar that I think you're gonna enjoy. But before that, it's time for the 3-point landing questions. Let's go from just watching a video to taking action. Here we go. Question number 1. How will you use time blocking to fix your schedule? Number 2, what does an intentional life look like for you? And number 3, where do you need to be so good that they can't ignore you? And if you like this video and will take action after watching it, give me a #believe down in the comments as well.
So we have to lower the bar from this impossible height where we put it, which is you have a one true passion, and if you figure it out, you're going to love your work starting the next day. And if you get it wrong, you're destined for a life of misery. Like, we have to lower that bar down to, there are many different things upon which you could build a life of real fulfillment and passion. But it's not just dart throwing, right? I mean, it has to be something that you have an interest in. It has to be something that you think would reward you with more flexibility and options as you got better at it, right? So it's not just arbitrary, but most people could probably pretty quickly identify 6 or 7 directions that pass those qualifiers. And so a lot of what I'm saying is that's enough. That's enough for it to pass the bar. I like this, maybe it matches some of my skills. I like the options it would open up if I did it well. It seems to resonate in some sort of ill-defined or ambiguous way. That's all enough for something to be the foundation of a passionate career. And there's probably a lot of things that pass that criterion. That's okay.
If you want to know the 3 amazing habits that the 1% use every day, check out the video right there next to me. I think you'll enjoy it. Continue to believe, and I'll see you there.
Other than the 5-second rule, there is one habit that I have adopted in the last 3 years.